So how did you get involved in space in the first?
Okay, so my background is in physics, but interestingly enough, when I did my honors degree in physics, I actually studied space physics here in South Africa. And so one of my first jobs was around research in space physics. So I studied the what we call magnetospheric storm, how the sun actually emits plasmas, which then hits the there's all sorts of processes that happen that affects technology here. And so that's essentially how I got in on the scientific side. But I very quickly learned that I actually had a flair for policy and strategy because I worked for government for over 20 years in the sort of policy, science policy space, and zoned in on the space side as well. So that's essentially how I landed in the discipline.
So were you a sci-fi nerd before that?
I was involved in my background is solid state physics. Then I got into research, as I said, in space, looking at back then it was neural networks. So I like the computing scientific aspect. So in a way, yes, maybe. Yeah.
But it wasn't the TV shows or anything like
Oh
that
no,
that drew you in.
Star Trek was huge here in South Africa. Star Wars, yes, definitely big influence, and of course,
I'm really intrigued in terms of the mission or the brief that you worked through to develop the space agency in South
yeah.
Africa, and how much of the agenda is about space exploration and how much of the agenda is about Earth applications for the science that's going on.
I would say 90% of is actually on the application side. I would say about 5 to 10% is on the exploration side. Not that we actually having specific missions to the moon or Mars, for that matter, or to other planets, but we do support missions from NASA, the European Space Agency. So just to put that in context, if you think about the Earth, uh, and then if you're launching, let's say, a rocket from the US, and as it goes over, it comes over Africa, but you lose sight of it. So we have a ground station here in Africa that helps to take control and issue some of the commands here from South Africa to some of those rockets that you see being taken
Yeah.
off from the US and in French Guiana as well. It actually comes over our footprint. And so we do, for example, the Solar Parker mission, the Chandrayaan mission that went to the moon, some of the Mars missions were supported here from South Africa. So from a space exploration side, that's what we're looking at. And more recently, the space agency has signed an agreement with NASA to host the fourth deep space network. So there's three deep space networks across the Earth. One is in Australia, Spain, and the US. So now we're building a redundant one. We're looking at a redundant one in South Africa. That's to support all the future Mars and lunar missions as well, here from South Africa. So that's what's on the cards
Okay.
for March from the space.
And how important in a scale of things is space exploration and the space agencies within the African nations? Is it growing um, in importance and the opportunities that it provides? Each of the African nations have their own space agencies.
I think there's just a handful of agencies on the continent, probably less than 10 that I can say that are fully up and running and functional. Although I should admit that in the last 3 years or so, we've seen about 20 different agencies cropping up. But they're still in the nascent phases, just in the startup phases. The more mature ones is Algeria, Egypt, South Africa, Nigeria, as an example, Ghana as well. Space exploration itself is not a major component of the African space program, or let's say a feature of the national space programs in Africa. Because the key driver, policy driver for these national space programs is actually on the space application side, mainly Earth observation, but also looking at
Yep.
telecommunications, global navigation, satellite services, or what we call GPS. Yeah, so that's mainly the key
Yep.
focus of the space programs in Africa.
And agriculture as well, as there's some programs that are looking at agricultural applications, I believe.
Yeah, look, agriculture is just one component. If you're looking at Earth observation, like for example, here in South Africa, the major focus, as I said, is on space applications. And just to give you a sense in terms of the
Yeah.
genesis of how we set up the space program, at the point when we were setting up the agency and going through the legislative process and developing the strategy for the country, what we did was we invited various different government departments around a table and essentially pose the question to them to say, if we are setting up a space program, what is it that you want us to help you with? And the reason why we asked the question in that way, we recognized that a number of government departments were actually using satellite imagery for decision-making purposes, whether it's the environment, agriculture, or the coastal management, urban planning, rural development. So there was a lot of this work already being done in various government departments. And practically most government department, majority, had what we call geographic information systems or GIS units inside of the government departments.
Okay.
And when we did that, I think we had like more than 15 different key priority areas, and we clustered them into 3 areas. So the first one is your natural resource environment. So this is looking at the environmental aspects. And there you'd have agriculture, urban planning, coastal management, water management, and so on. The second key priority area was safety and security. Okay. So under safety and security, you would look at disease burdens, you look at asset movement across the different borders between South Africa and other neighboring countries. You would look at peacekeeping missions in Africa as an example. How do we support those? And so there's a whole priority listing areas that we should look under safety and security. And then the third one was innovation and economic growth. So we wanted to see a thriving space economy, space industry, looking at spin-offs and spin-outs into the space industry and so on. So those were the three main clusters that emerged from that conversation with different government departments. So that's essentially the genesis in terms of how the focus for the space program.
This is fascinating to me in terms of how an agency forms and prioritizes and the policy making, because clearly it's taxpayers that goes to fund things, so there has to be a prioritization about repaying back to the taxpayer over some kind of time frame. With space exploration and with the space agencies and anything to do with space, we are talking about a slightly extended time frame. How much of the time frames, when you were putting policies together and thinking through it, what sort of time frame were you putting inside the scope of the policies that you were thinking about?
So we normally look at about a 10-year timeline, but essentially what we do is we do a review every 5 years, just to make sure that policy and strategy remains relevant. In fact, at the space agency, we just did what we call an institutional review, which is normally done every 5 years. And we bring experts from the rest of the world in very key domain areas and ask them to do an assessment in terms of how we perform. And if there's any recommendations coming from that particular review, it then gets put into the strategy policy domain as well, in terms of how we can improve what we're doing. And so 10-year timelines, but 5-year review periods. But in terms of government planning, government across the board works on a 3-year cycle, a budget cycle. So your budget is committed for a 3-year rolling cycle, essentially. Yeah. So that's how we operate here.
Do you expect to go into space yourself?
I would love to, but I think the cost is quite prohibitive in a way. Because if you had to do to get an astronaut into, let's say, the International Space Station, can cost you about $80 million for the full training and so on.
Yeah.
So that's not cheap. I think many people have that aspiration, but it's just the cost of doing it is just exorbitant. Yeah.
But if given the opportunity, you would take it?
Of course I would. Yes, definitely. Not going to Mars, though.
Mars is a bit of a different kettle of fish.
It is. And I think when we're talking about Mars, it's almost like a one-way ticket. No return.
I expect my grandchildren who haven't been born yet, they might live to 150, maybe even 200 years old. So suddenly, because of longevity, the opportunity for somebody in a family group to actually go into space or even to the moon and live in a planet actually starts to become a possibility. Because although it's not in close reach now, as a species, I think we're going to live long enough that I think my grandchildren could live off planet.
That's a definite reality.
That brings in a whole different dynamic.
Exactly. Think of aviation in the 1940s. That's when it started. But look at aviation today. It's like a common novelty. You can travel practically anywhere in the world, but it wasn't the case in the 1940s. I suspect space is going to move that way. Space, what do you call it? What's the word that sorry, it's escaping me now. So essentially, you could travel to space very routinely, almost like you're flying on an aircraft in the near future. So we're getting, I think we're going to get to that point in a few years, actually.
As the costs come down, it becomes more of a possibility, at least for the rest of us.
Yeah.
So if you look at what's going on, and you've got a great insight about an awful lot of things that are going on as an industry insider, so to speak, what's the thing that you think, or a couple of things that you think are most exciting that you see in maybe the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah. So first of all, I think having led a space agency, I think the role of space agencies are changing. And we've seen that with the Columbia incident, where even NASA decided that it was actually going to rely more on the industry rather than develop these technologies solely internally. And I think that's essentially spurned what we call Space 4.0, which is more the industry coming on board in terms of the space value chain. So even here in South Africa, we decided that's actually the way the world is going, and that even the agency needs to relook at its mandate and how it operates as well. Prior to myself joining the agency, I think the mindset was that a lot of what needed to be done could be done inside an agency. But now the reality is that we have to look at it very differently. And the way we see this is that if you have to deliver products and services, you have to look at the space value chain. So you're looking at the satellite segments, you're looking at the ground segments that talk to the satellite, bring back the data, essentially what we call telemetry, tracking, and command. And then you have a data segment where you store and you process the data and you package it into the products and services that are actually required at the end. So if you look at that value chain, the way we rationalize the role of the agency is that we look at the core infrastructure as a backbone. But then what you do is then you subcontract industry on the upstream where you're building satellites. So they can design, develop, and build the satellites. We contract out. And then even on the downstream, where you now can bring in industry. So if you have a data segment with high performance computing platforms, you can now attract the industry to come and use your platform. And the industry doesn't have to invest in the infrastructure. All they do is log into the high performance computing platform where all the satellite data is sitting. I mean, at Sansa, we had data that went back right up till 1972 when the first Landsats satellites were switched on. So we've got an archive from 1972 up until today where we do about 12 to 15 satellite passes per day, essentially. So you can come in, access the data, build your products and services, which then gets taken up by the end users. So now you see the agency's role is more or less stepping back a little bit, but relying on the industry to be more innovative and look at driving down cost and managing the risk and so on, as opposed to all of that being done by government. And industry is much more eloquent in doing that rather than the public service, which is more lethargic and bureaucratic, to say the least. So industry involvement is certainly ramping up quite considerably. And that's a global phenomenon. It's not just here in South Africa. And I think we're just following suit here.
So the role of the national agencies becomes much more as a facilitator and to provide a welcoming environment for external investment.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. And that's what we've done in South Africa as well. As an agency, we were able to attract investment or investor funding, as opposed to just purely relying on government or the fiscus, for that matter.
And is that what you observe with most fledgling national agencies? They're adopting that model?
I think, to be quite honest, it's probably just a handful of agencies that are adopting that model. There's obviously a prime example, but we see that happening in Europe. The European Space Agency is driving more or less in the same direction. And I think some agencies in Europe. Not so much in Africa. I think South Africa has been unique because I think it also depends on your maturity level. We've had a space program going back to the 1980s, whereas some of the space programs that are just established more recently in the next, let's say, last 5 years, the majority of them. So they still learn in the learning curve process, essentially, and building up the technical capability. and industry is not so much plugged into that particular ecosystem as yet. Whereas in South Africa, we've had 4 decades where industry has more or less thrived, and there's quite a big industry base that you can utilize as well. So it depends on your maturity level in terms of where you are.
I don't know how much you can tell me about your role in Saudi and what you're doing there.
Yeah, so Saudi Arabia, I think the Crown Prince has essentially passed a declaration to set up a space program. I thought it was in 2018. And so the Saudi Space Commission was established. And so they're wanting to essentially establish a program. And so essentially coming in as an advisor to establish the space program, essentially, for the next 3 years at least.
How very exciting.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's quite a
Yeah.
welcome challenge, if I can put it that way.
If I might say so, I think that you've got great qualifications to perform that role on a number of occasions over the next 20 years, if that's what you desire. I was speaking fairly recently with somebody that actually sent me a very interesting kind of satellite tracking app, and it showed all the amount of space debris that there is floating up there. And that's going to be an interesting challenge for governmental agencies and private companies to figure out, well, if we're putting stuff up there, we need to find out how to get it back down again and get it down safely and in an appropriate manner. And I think that's going to be an interesting conversation over the next few years as well.
It's going to be actually, it's taking center stage in the United Nations at the moment. So there was a working group that was established, and they've essentially put together guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space. And how do you preserve this? Because this is a resource for all humankind. And when you start to put a lot of debris in there, the collisions is actually greatly increased. And the more collisions you have, the greater debris you create as well. So you need to limit that more responsible. And I think what's also fueling this is that if you look around, you'll see there's quite a number of different players coming in wanting to put mega constellations. We're talking about tens of thousands of satellites into outer space. So that's going to also create some tensions around how we manage the long-term sustainability of outer space. The one thing I should mention, David, is that the space law is very different in outer space versus, let's say, in aviation. So aviation, if you're flying an aircraft, you're flying through different sovereign, whereas in outer space, there is no sovereignty. No country or region can claim sovereignty above, let's say, 100 kilometers. And the law is also very different. If there's an aircraft, let's say, a crash, we apply what is called a strict-based liability. That means the families of the passengers that passed away in an aircraft crash, there's a certain formula that's applied in terms of compensation. In outer space, it's different. It's not strict-based. It's fault-based liability. So you have to prove fault before you can claim liability. How do you prove fault? You have to understand and constantly track the space debris to know which debris hit your satellite. And so that is going to be quite a arduous task. And there's just a few countries that are monitoring the space debris. Not all countries have that capability. So we have to rely on certain countries to get that kind of information. So that also is going to be tested in the long run in the space law aspects.
It opens up a whole new way of thinking about so many of the things. That one of my interests as well is the concept, and I am talking 200 years, 300 years, 400 years maybe into the future, where the opportunity to form a colony with your friends, and you have a particular point of view. So I'm fascinated as to what will happen in 400-500 years with these different colonies floating around doing different things.
Absolutely, yeah. And a lot of these things are first come, first serve as well. You set the protocols as well, which could be quite sensitive in many respects, with different countries wanting to push different boundaries. But I think that's why the United Nations is ramping up some of the focus in terms of some of these aspects that could be problematic in the future.
Thank you so much for spending some time chatting with me today. I really appreciate it. I do hope your documentation comes through in time for your trip tomorrow. Really appreciate it. And hopefully we'll meet again, maybe in person at a conference sometime, and I'll come over and introduce myself and say hi.
I would certainly look forward to that. Thank you, David.